Welcome to FutureLab.
We were told to do that.
This is our second episode. How do you think the first one went?
Fantastic. Well, Denise and I both cried, so that's a great start.
It was intense, Joe.
Introductory episode.
So just so everyone knows, I'm Danny.
Yeah, Trevor Hendy.
And Denise Furness.
Yep, and
Dr.
we
D.
are the hosts of FutureLab, where we explore health span and all that comes into it and underneath it, what feeds into it, the concept of health span and how to live a long life, but to live a healthy life and a fulfilling life. So we're going to be talking to all sorts of experts that feed into that. And today we've got Dr. Joanna McMillan, who is many things. I'll start with dietitian. I actually had your bio here. I had to cut it down, so excuse me, I've missed out on anything important. But we're going to have a chat with Dr. Joanna McMillan on, well, I'm sure on lots of things. We'll start with diet, and we'll start also with, I think our thinking around diet is a good place to start as well.
We're supposed to start with how you going, Joanne? You know, like Joanne.
How are you going, Joe?
Say that she's our
I
first amazing
haven't
guest.
introduced her yet, and then I was going to say, how are you going?
Well,
How are you
I
going,
wasn't
Joe?
sure. I
For
thought you were going
those,
to go
for
into a
those that
question.
don't know who we're talking to, let's start with the bio that I've got there, and then I'll ask you how you are. So we've got Dr. Joanna McMillan. She's an accredited Dr. Joanna McMillan, accredited practicing dietitian, PhD qualified nutrition scientist, fellow of the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine, and graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. She's got a career spanning 3 decades and has the credentials and the experience to earn her place as one of Australia's most sought after and trusted health and wellbeing experts. I'm going to miss this section because we're going to go on and go to the end. She's the author of 8 published books and 4 audiobooks covering a range of topics, including gut, brain, and heart health. And she's an experienced speaker and MC with over 1 million views of her 2017 TEDx talk on what to eat for real change. Welcome, Joanna. How are you?
Very tired. That stuff took me 3 decades. God, it makes me sound old, doesn't it? 3 decades of stuff.
Oh,
I'm very well, thank you.
that's good. How is it in Sydney at the moment? Because we had a slight confusion thinking that you were in Melbourne. The weather's awful here, so hopefully it's better for you over there.
I know, Melbourne is my second home, and it does make me feel like I'm back in Scotland because it can be, 4 seasons in one day in Melbourne. But I'm in shorts and t-shirt because it's sunny and warm here in Sydney today. But anyway, I'm very glad to join you with technology.
Speaking of warm, Joe, my wife is Joe, so there's already a warmth here because of Joe, and also my heritage is majorly Scottish. So I went back to Scotland last year with my mother and explored some of her heritage over to Ayrshire and go right back to riding with the William Wallace and all that sort of stuff in our heritage. That might show up in my DNA test, actually.
Yeah.
I've been hacked to death at some point in time. But the warmth of the Scottish accent and talking to a Joe, I'm pretty excited about today.
Oh, nice. Well, Trevor is a very Scottish name, I was at school with a number of Trevors, so,
Fantastic. Well, in preparing for our chat, I did hop onto that TEDx video, and it did grab me because it's something that I think about a lot, and that is our growing obsession with food. We've got this consciousness now that's been growing over recent decades about the need to be healthy, about the need to eat well. But has this growing obsession, has it become a growing obsession, sort of our thinking about food and the need to be healthy? And if so, how has that impacted our relationship with food? Has it had a positive or a negative impact?
Look, I think there's a spectrum there. There's actually now psychologists have officially named the disorder that is an unhealthy obsession with eating healthily, and that's called orthorexia. And that really highlights the fact that, some people it's becoming so stressful. There was a survey I was involved with just last year that literally picked up on this, that people were so stressed with, it was just another chore, another thing we had to be concerned about, another thing to worry about. Oh, if I'm eating this or I'm eating that, or I'm not eating this or not eating that, what's going to be the outcome for me? And this is going to dramatically impact my health and wellness. So I really think it's key. I mean, what I was trying to get across in my TEDx talk, which was some time ago now, but I stand by what the messaging was, which was essentially around, let's not all lose our minds and think everything has to be about the best supplements and there are some great supplements. There are some great, your podcast is called FutureLab. You're looking towards things that can help us from science to live longer, healthier lives. But let's not lose sight of the fact that food should also be an enormously pleasurable part of life. And there's things that we get from just eating well and having whole foods in our diet that we don't get from some of these other sorts of ways of eating. So I think it's really, really important. At the other end of the spectrum, though, I've also got to say that the vast majority of people eat terribly. So we're not managing. My fear is that by being too, dogmatic and making it sound so unsexy, this sort of talk about what we need to do to eat healthily. And it's really easy for people like Denise and I to go down that scientific path and talk all about the science and actually lose sight. I make myself all the time step back and look at the big picture around what about pleasure? What about joy? What about the fact that sitting down and eating together, when we look at the people who live the longest, healthiest lives on planet Earth, that's one of the key things that comes across is that social aspect of food and just simply sharing food and sitting down together is such an important part of it. So let's not lose sight of it in the exciting science.
Yeah. And I think that's how we've connected, Jo, through having wonderful times eating food. That's we have presented at conferences all around together, and then being at these events, eating, having a great time, chatting.
Glass of wine.
Yeah, and a few glasses of wine here and there. But even our dinner last night when we were all just catching up, we had dessert, which, it's fine. But I once upon a time did have orthorexia, and that would have caused me anxiety having that dessert. And if I did eat it, because I would have wanted it, I probably then would have gone and overtrained the next day, ran for hours, done whatever to try to compensate. And I was someone that thought about food all the time, and I thought I was being healthy. But looking back, I was like, oh my goodness, that is not a way to live. And I did go on and develop an autoimmune disease, and I think that was part of it. It's not the only thing, but I had a very unhealthy relationship with food, even though I thought I was being so healthy.
I've got a cool story to share here, Jo, is that I was working on a seminar many years ago helping out, and we had one of the guys on the seminar. He was ridiculously healthy, super healthy, worked out, basically skin folds, counting calories, doing his macros, looking at organic, all this sort of stuff, and the elements of raw and all this sort of stuff. And he used to go to his mum's for dinner, and his mum would try and cook up the old meat the way it was and the 3 veg and everything else. And he would be like, Mum, why don't you understand? I don't eat this anymore. And she wouldn't bring him out ice cream afterwards and blah, blah, blah. And he had this massive problem with it. Anyway, he did this seminar, and throughout the seminar, he realized that mum's cooking had more nutrition in it from the love, from what she was bringing to it, what she was actually doing from the way she cared. It was her way of caring. And that if he could receive that love, that had more positive impact on his body than whatever negative was of this little bit of dairy or whatever else that was actually there. And so he had this gigantic realization, was in the front of the room, tears in his eyes, realizing he'd been rejecting his mother's love all this time. And that Sunday night when they finished, he went and had dinner with the family, and the mum cooked the meal and everything. And he sat there and he realized the part of him that had become so anal about it wasn't there, and he could see what she was doing, and he was in tears. And then when he received the food, she was in tears. She couldn't believe her. So that little boy was now he's like 30. Your little boy was now receiving this food, blah, blah, blah. And so he came back and shared with us at a completion night on the Thursday night about, you won't believe it, oh my God. And then around the dinner table, the family opened up about all sorts of stuff that was happening in their life. And so food, we can put it into this place where it's about nutrition, but we miss the part that isn't love senior, isn't connection senior, isn't care, isn't actually, this is the way I do it. Can't our bodies process these things if we've got the right elements in place? So I never forget that story, because it really impacted me, because I had a tiny bit of it, but I was like, oh, that was such a wake up call for me. That's like when mum brings those foods out, I don't eat that anymore. It's like, well, I'll have a little bit, occasionally I'll go, no, not tonight, but other nights, thanks mum, that's beautiful.
Well, Jo, do you think that makes a difference, that the emotional state that you're in when you're eating has I don't know to what extent, maybe you can tell me, what extent of influence does that have on your well-being?
Well, I think the obvious thing that comes to mind is gut health. We see this dramatic rise and I'm not a clinical dietitian. I don't work one-on-one anymore, but the number of people that contact me or talk to me and ask me about, because I've hosted a number of shows on gut health and the gut microbiome and so on, that's been a big area of interest of mine over the last few years. And I've noticed this dramatic rise, and we see it, especially with age, we see more and more people having these gut problems. And, one of the biggest areas of research is in gut hypnotherapy. So it's nothing to do with the actual foods. Everyone always assumes that that's to do with I'm intolerant or allergic to specific foods, and they start cutting foods out, and often they end up, I've seen people, one of the people we had on Catalyst literally had about 9 foods that she was prepared to eat because she'd cut so many things out because she was associating it with gut health. When for a lot of people, the success of gut hypnotherapy shows us that it's actually about that gut-brain interaction, and a lot of it is coming from anxiety and stress. And if you think about the way that we eat, if you relax and you sit down and you lay the table, and look, listening to Trevor's story there, I've got 2 teenage boys. I was thinking the only time they talk to me is when we sit down and we're around the table. You're in a relaxed state of mind. Your gut is then relaxed. Your body is able to put all of the focus onto digestion and, of course, thinking if you're having conversation and so on. But you're essentially in a rested mode of, okay, now we're taking on board food. Whereas if you're eating on the go, and I see this all the time with people rushing around the city and eating a sandwich on the escalator or eating at their desk while they're, desperately trying to do emails, and then they're rushing off to something else, you're not actually allowing your gut to relax and do the job of eating digestion. And digestion, of course, takes place over a very long time, but especially the early part of digestion when food is in your stomach, you need to be in that relaxed state. So blood flow is going to your intestines, to your stomach, and you're working on that early part of digestion. So yeah, I think undoubtedly this is an enormous part of it. The other thing that we know is that actually people forget about what they ate. So dietitians know this, and it's incredibly frustrating. And when we look at studies that have tried to use food frequency questionnaires or 24-hour recalls or all of these different methods we've got to try to assess what exactly it is someone eats, we see that the data is so inaccurate, and it's so difficult to get to what is someone actually.
Those 3 Mars bars were so forgettable. What do you mean? Why would I be expected to remember
Why
that?
would I forget that?
Yeah. Oh, I forgot I had an ice cream at the beach with the kids. And, I forgot I had a second helping of that. It's really, really hard. So I think unless you're very consciously sitting down to eat, it's very easy to forget about what you eat and not really have it as a key focus at all. So there's that balance between what we were talking about before, where there's this over obsession with eating healthily, and then having that healthy relationship where it's got the correct priority in the day, but it's not dominating your thoughts all of the time, but you're giving it enough priority to take time out of your day and actually sit down to eat. And of course, it's not going to happen at every meal. I'm looking at my dirty bowl of porridge next to me thinking, I did exactly that this morning because I was trying to desperately get some emails out before I talked to you. So I did eat my breakfast sitting at my computer. But so it's not about doing it perfectly all of the time. But if you can give some priority to meals, I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Can we just go back to the first thing that you talked about, which was when you're stressed, you don't digest your food. I'm interested to know then, what happens to that undigested food as it passes through your gut?
Can I just throw something in really quickly?
I call this the rest and digest. So I say to my patients, clients, particularly those that are trying to get out of, whether it's an autoimmune or something, they're dealing with something. And I say to them, if they, truly want to get well, they need to get into that rest and digest space. Because often they're just not turning off the stress response, not even just with eating, just all day. They're in this underlying chronic stress. So not only for just digestion, for that healing, to sleep properly, everything. So yeah, rest and digest.
And that's what I was going to say there is we're quite often, we're finishing each other's sentences at the moment, Denise. But, but literally the stress is something we haven't digested. So there's a situation or a scenario or a hurtful thing that somebody said or a series of work that I've got to do that I just can't cope with that and the kids and everything else. So there's a situation that we haven't digested. We haven't actually come to terms with it. So we're living in the fight or flight. We're living in the opposition to it. We're living in the resistance of it. And of course that is, we're living in a state of dis-ease, because I don't know how to handle it, what to do. So how possibly can our body, because it's all connected, how can our body digest correctly if we haven't digested our life at the moment? So that's I just wanted to add that little bit in there as we're going down that path, down that rabbit hole.
No, I like that line of thought. We're not digesting the stress. No. Well, what in answer to what happens, a lot of people think, oh, well, therefore I'm not getting, unfortunately, it often leads to weight gain because you are still getting the energy for the most part out of your food, but you're often going to get gut pain, you're going to get poor absorption of particular nutrients. Often it can lead to things like diarrhea and symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, because when you're in, and the best way to think of it is when you're really nervous about something, let's say you've got to give a presentation or you've got to give a speech at an event or something like that, that feeling you get where butterflies are in your stomach, you probably can't eat in that sort of acute stress situation, and you might well find yourself running to the toilet. Now that's the classic fight or flight. So the stress hormones are actually directing blood flow away from your blood towards muscles so that you can run away from that proverbial, tiger or whatever it is. But you're in that mode to either I've got to fight or I've got to flight. I'm not thinking about I've got to digest my food. Actually, what you're thinking about is get rid of it. So hence you often end up having to run to the loo. You're getting yourself ready to be able to fight or flight. So, that's what can lead to, and if that's happening continually, then that can be that sort of end of the spectrum of irritable bowel syndrome. On the other hand, chronic stress can also lead to, in some people, and this is where individual differences come in, to less motility of the gut. So the gut becomes very, very sluggish. And then it leads to the other end of the scale where you have constipation and you aren't, and stress has this overlapping sort of effect where it then makes us eat differently. Often when people are stressed, they'll then reach for comfort foods or very sugary foods or very high energy foods, which makes sense if you've got to run from the tiger, but doesn't make so much sense if you're at your computer trying to bash out a work deadline or whatever else it might be, or deal with your teenage children or whatever it is that's causing you stress, shouting at your partner. So, those sorts of, it's almost as if our stress responses, the way the body is reacting to stress is, from an evolutionary sense, quite primitive, but it's not fitting well with the ways that would help us to deal with the chronic stress that so many of us are dealing with in the modern world.
And you mentioned the gut-brain axis as well. So when you talk about undigested food, my thinking is we have a whole lot of undigested proteins, a whole lot of undigested carbohydrates. Does that become fodder for bacteria? Does that change our microbiome landscape and therefore influence our gut-brain axis?
A lot of bloating.
I don't know, Denise, you wanted to say something there.
I was just saying, a lot of bloating, like what you're talking about when you mentioned before, Joanna, about the gut pain, the bloating, the distension, things like that. So, and feeling heavy, feeling tired. Some people just feel absolutely exhausted after they eat too. Brain fog, all sorts of things.
Yeah. So that's all happening quite unconsciously, though, right? A person is actually still focused on the thing that they're worried about, or the thing that their focus, their attention is on. How am I going to get the kids to school, or how am I going to finish off this workload, or whatever it is? And they're eating, as you said, comfort eating. So a lot of this is happening unconsciously. Right. So then, I've got this little, my gut feels a bit funny, but I've got to keep thinking about this.
Yeah, you ignore it.
Where the problem builds up. For the people that are listening, we're talking about normal life, aren't we? We're just talking about day-to-day, moment to moment, when actually a whole lot is happening while you're thinking about one or two things, that are repeating in your mind over and over again. There's a whole cacophony of, things occurring in your whole system that really what we're talking about is becoming more aware of what that is. So it's almost slow down to understand what's going on here so you can relieve yourself from this cycle that is just repeating itself over and over again, because the stress leads to more stress.
And it is a cycle. That's
a cycle.
Some people
It's
just
repetitive.
eat the same way every day for years in, years
and then
out.
feel guilty and shamed, feel not good enough about themselves, and what my parents said about me is true, and all this sort of stuff. It's like it all just cycles back around to having a person not feel as though they're in control of their own life, or they're happy, or they're enjoying it, or that they can conquer the next thing.
You made me think of something, Danny, there, though, when you were talking about what actually influences the gut microbiome. I think it's worth just bringing it back to the point that we have to feed not just ourselves, but you have to feed your gut microbiome, and we don't think about that. And when you look at modern, the human race, by the way, is pretty spectacular. We've been so successful as a species in part because we've been so adaptable to different diets. So if you travel around the world, you know, you can go to almost any country in the world and show me their traditional diet, even Scotland. And the traditional diet is pretty healthy. You know, in Scotland, we've got fabulous mussels and salmon and barley and oats. And you know, there's good food there when you look at what was traditionally available. So we've got this sort of broad array and adaptable, but what we're not adaptable to is the modern, highly processed Western style diet. And that's what's not feeding our gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome, whole species of microbes are being killed off, not being passed down from generation to generation. So our diversity is getting narrower and narrower. And there's some of my favorite microbiome studies look at the microbiomes of, you know, kids in a very rural African village living much more of a traditional kind of much more primitive life, comparing them to urban children in somewhere like Florence in Italy is one of my favorite studies. And it shows this massive difference in their gut microbiomes. And that's got this knock-on effect into what nutrients are produced. And not just nutrients, but there's all of these metabolites that get produced by the gut microbiome that then travel up through our body and go. It's why I get frustrated with people who just, you know, take vitamin supplements and think that's all they need to do for good health. Because there's all of these hundreds of different compounds that we need that go to our brain, to our heart, to the liver, to the, you know, we talk about the gut-brain axis, but there's a gut-lung axis, a gut-heart axis, a gut-liver axis. So all of these things are really, really important. And that's where we're going wrong. So people are not, we think we have very diverse diets because we've got supermarkets full of food, but they're all made from the same ingredients. You know, I presented last year, I presented a series of seminars for PwC that were on the future of food. And I had this slide that even I was bowled over by when I put it together. And I went, oh my God, I can't believe this. And it showed that something like 95% of the world's calories comes from 12 foods. 12.
Wow.
And we think we have this diversity of foods. It's extraordinary.
So that comes down to the staple crops that we've created because of sedentary agriculture over the last only short few thousand years, really, isn't it?
And control.
And
there's control
years,
aspects in here too, and profit and everything else that's further upstream of why have we done this, convenience, all those sort of things. Question, you just blew my mind. Blew my mind, like gut mind. Gut, when you're saying, are you saying access or axis?
Axis.
Axis. So
Connected.
you said gut lung, gut heart, gut liver. Because
everything.
The whole
heard
body,
gut brain.
yeah.
Got everything.
So wow.
The microbes
It's kind of blowing my mind and blowing my gut
Joe,
at the same time.
we might need to go into that in a little bit more depth because I think he's interested.
Talk about the metabolites.
But what you're basically saying is these lung, heart, liver, the three that I just heard you reel off, they're major functions of the body, all connected to the gut. And the gut is where we're holding stress. It's where we're putting foods in and out, where toxins are not getting released. This is like
70% of your
kind
immune
of a miracle,
system's
isn't
in
it?
your gut. Yeah.
Just to even understand that this is probably where a lot of our stuff is going on.
And most of the serotonin, the neurotransmitter serotonin, most of it's made in your gut by gut bacteria, the very gut bacteria that Joe was talking about.
Serotonin, of course, is the hormone of, oxytocin is connection, isn't it? Serotonin
Oxytocin's,
is,
love.
Yeah, so serotonin is the one.
What's interesting about that, because I hear that fact put forward a lot, and it's absolutely true. Your gut is producing much of the serotonin, but the serotonin produced by your gut doesn't cross into your brain.
Yeah, it's about motility.
Yeah, so it's got.
Hang on, what's motility? What's
Doing a poo, getting the waste out of your body.
Okay.
But
so, which is, by the way,
I have heard
digestion again, isn't it? So
I have heard it speculated, though, that because of the gut-brain connection and the extensive nerve network that we have from the gut to the brain, particularly the vagus nerve, that the serotonin produced in the gut does have an influence on our mood and the way that our brain functions as well. So it might not be a neurotransmitter produced in our brain, but that's not to mean that it might not influence our mood or how our brain functions.
No, you're absolutely right, and Denise might be able to put more on this. My understanding of gut-produced serotonin is that it has a whole load of other functions. It can't cross the blood-brain barrier, so it's not influencing the levels directly of its serotonin in the brain, but other things produced in the gut are. So it's got other functions, and that's what's really important to remember. I think because we've all been taught serotonin is to do with feeling nice and feeling happy. And
happy hormone, yeah.
It's a happy hormone, yeah, pleasant feelings and calmness that we forget that it does other things in the body too. So I think that's what's really key to remember. But what you're really touching on is that there is a massive influence with what's going on with fermentation of various different components in food that happens largely in the colon. Those metabolites are going through the brain, and there are nervous system messaging that goes through the vagus nerve up to the brain, and that does influence the production of serotonin and other neurotransmitters. But it also influences things like inflammation in the brain, the protection of neurons, that we know that there's an intimate relationship between what's going on in your gut and your long-term risk of having things like dementia, and even Alzheimer's and potentially Parkinson's too is starting to have this gut link identified, and mood disorders. So we've known for a long time. I mean, when I first studied nutrition, gosh, almost 30 years ago now, we were kind of taught that, well, yeah, diet's important for depression, but it's really hard to make depressed people eat well. And it was sort of almost, well, it's too hard. It was in the too hard basket. And no one really understood the mechanisms. So it was assumed that it was to do with nutrients or needing nutrients for your brain. And that is part of it. But now we've got such good evidence around the fact that we do have influence over our brain function and over our brain performance. So even if you're not struggling with any sort of mental health condition, most of us want our brains to stay healthy and keep firing. We don't want to lose our marbles later in life, and we want to have good performance of our brain. It's one of the, whenever I do a talk in corporates, that's what they always ask me about, is how can I keep my brain creative, and how can I prevent brain fog? How can I prevent the 3 p.m. sort of energy slump that happens? And a lot of that is coming down to the gut microbiome and feeding the gut microbiome really well. And we're doing that badly in Western diets.
And I think too, and our first intro session, we talked a little bit about certain nutrients, not just our macronutrients like fats and carbs, but micronutrients, needing them for protein synthesis, DNA, enzymes, our genetics, but also the phytonutrients and all those things that influence our gut microbiome as well, and turning genes off and on. And I think if we think about food, like we said before, it's really about getting rid of the ultra-processed food, having this foundation of whole foods, getting a diversity where you are getting, and I think plenty of protein too for muscle, as we had a little bit of a chat about this earlier, sarcopenia, something that occurs as we age, we lose muscle.
Muscle wasting.
Muscle wasting,
yes,
exactly.
Because I asked the question, so what, encyclopedia?
Yeah, sarcopenia.
It's encyclopedia, not sarcopenia.
And it's something
muscle wasting.
It's just assumed to happen as we age, but actually it doesn't have to happen. If you're having a good diet, plenty of protein, then and you're doing exercise,
so
you can actually
even
put on muscle. But but I think having the foundations, the diet, the exercise, and the way that I see the supplements too is the icing on the cake. They're not going to fix everything. I think this is what you were sort of saying, Joe. Can't just turn and say, okay, I'm going to have these supplements to fix my gut health or my mood. It's when you want to get to the place that we're talking about in this, this podcast, health span, that extra 10 years of life feeling amazing. It's the nutrition, it's eating in that state that we said too, that relaxed state, having the community, it's the movement, and then it's having these things where, because unfortunately, I think the way, and you might get onto this and tell us more, the way that we have, even if we're eating healthy, we process our foods, they're something like, if I think about folate, for example, it's heat and light sensitive. Even if you get that broccoli, if you're not cooking it yourself and it's sat around for a while, and then you cook it as well, like in some hot water, maybe not over cooking it like my mum used to we used to get mushy veggies. Love you, Mum, but you did really break down a lot of those nutrients. But
eat it with love.
Yes, but there was love, exactly. That's why it's probably okay as a kid. But the reality is sometimes we're not, even when we're eating well, we may actually still be low in some nutrients. And if we are highly stressed, like we've talked about too, we're going to be burning through certain things like B vitamins and stuff as well.
But getting back to that microbiome then, and you're saying eating a healthy diet promotes a good microbiome, a healthy microbiome, a diverse microbiome. There are so many different healthy diets. And you said you had a look at a group of people in Africa. I know there was a study on the Hunza, and they ate milk and blood. And their microbiome, which wouldn't necessarily be considered something that we're familiar with in terms of a healthy microbiome, yet they were perfectly healthy. I imagine that the Inuit that eat a lot of meat and a lot of fat would not have what we consider a healthy microbiome, at least by the trends that we're familiar with. And yet they're perfectly healthy.
There's some different things going on there, though. I mean, those are sort of quite extreme examples. You know, the sort of African tribes that are shown to have very, you know, limited diets. That's not they also have a very different lifestyle. They're very much in touch with animals, with soil, there's all sorts of different exposures to microbes that they're getting.
Yeah.
When you look at most, and the Inuit are, there's some controversial stuff around them because we used to use them as well, hang on, they've got high fat diets and they don't get heart disease. Now that's being questioned. So there's some of that data that's not quite as robust as we really thought. But when we look at most hunter-gatherer communities, from modern hunter-gatherer communities to what we know about those that are in the past, and even just not even going back to hunter-gatherer societies, but just looking at people living a more traditional, let's put it that way, lifestyles around the world, largely what we see is that they have very, very fiber-rich. They eat a lot of different plant foods, whether or not they're also omnivores. And by the way, I'll just state up front that I strongly reject this push towards plant-based eating that there is at the moment, because not that you can't, if for moral reasons or whatever other reasons you want to be 100% plant-based, I can teach you how to do it and which supplements you'll have to take. But if we're just talking with a nutrition science hat on as what's the healthiest diet for humans, we're actually designed to be omnivores. But we're omnivores, which means we eat animal and plant foods, but it should be a diet that contains a lot of plant foods. So I prefer the term plant-rich rather than plant-based. Yeah. And that's where we're really going wrong. So we've got to stop this kind of blaming this food or that food and not being enough. The fact is that we are not eating enough fiber, not just fiber, but the diversity of fibers that these more traditional communities would consume. So, you know, we buy the same carrots and peas and corn every week. And then, you know, every now and again, you might throw something different in. The fact is 7% of Australians are eating the recommended serves of veggies. I mean, that's terrible. We're not eating enough nuts. We're not eating whole grains. We're having far too many refined grains. We don't have legumes. We don't have, you know, the leafy greens that we need to be having every single day. And so it's those whole foods with that diversity of not just fiber. Fiber is absolutely key for the microbiome, but it's this group, Denise touched on it a minute ago, and I was thinking about it. There's a group of compounds that are present in plant foods called polyphenols. Mm-hmm. And they include there's well over 100 different types of polyphenols, probably into the hundreds. And you don't get that in a supplement, not even in your green powder and your other stuff that, you know, I've got this column, My Day in a Plate, and I was just, before I talked to you, I was doing it. And she ate hardly any foods, and everything was a supplement and a powder and this protein powder added to her smoothie and a green powder added to that. And my feedback was, why don't you swap the green powder for a big salad? You know, why don't you just add a handful of spinach into your soup? Why don't you make a smoothie made with fruit and vegetables and nuts? And for some reason, we're forgetting about these hundreds of different compounds that we only get in whole foods. And polyphenols are the only group so far that have been called prebiotics that are not fibers. And they're associated with better brain health, with better gut health, with better heart health. And you know, that's where we're getting these particular phytonutrients only if we eat a whole food diet with plenty of plant foods. Whether you're vegan or you're omnivore, you got to eat lots of plant foods.
And eat them with love.
Eat them with love.
Yeah.
Something that you said earlier that in your previous education that it appeared too complex to getting depressed people to eat well, blah, blah, blah. It's too complex. We'll just put it away. And I think one of the things I notice that's common is that whenever we can make something complex simple, it makes people feel alive and free. Oh God, I can do that. You know, and the opposite is true as well. Whenever we make something simple, complex, what we do is we tie people up in knots and they get more stressed and more depressed and more things are going on. So one of our missions in the podcast is to take complex things and make them really simple. You know, even to nut it down by the time we finish the podcast today. Okay, what are the simple things that you recommend we do? But even just noticing that pattern of complex to simple or simple to complex, I think that's when we take something simple and we make it complex, what we're doing is we're putting it in the realm of, oh, look, you couldn't possibly understand this. You need to listen to your doctor, or you need to listen to your expert, or you need to listen to this person that's cornered that part of the market or whatever it is, rather than actually all the hints are right there for you. It's pretty simple. You know, get the things that are available to you. The things that you do need that aren't currently available to you because of the way the world has worked is some of the things that are good for us are no longer that readily available, which is where I do sort of like the reds and green powders because I'll pick up a handful of rocket you know, and I'll get it fresh from the market, organic, and I'll taste it, and my body says, take more, and I'll eat a whole lot more rocket, you know, and then certain things like that, I know I've got to get that fibre in, and then there's moments where I go, I can take that and supplement it or whatever else it is. But it seems to me we've just got to make the complex simple, because it is simple at the end of the day. What we need is available to us, and we talked in our first podcast about your gut feeling, that the doctor said to you, no, this is the path that you're going down, that's it, there's no, and your gut said, no, that's not right. You know, isn't it funny? Your gut says, no, that's not right.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd, you know, sort of propose that to you.
As if I'm against supplements, because I'm certainly not, but I would describe them the way Denise did before as the icing on the cake or the cherry.
Yes.
That's what they are. And the word,
it's a supplement.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got a little diagram I sometimes use in my presentations to try and explain this concept to people about personalized nutrition. And it starts with pick the low-hanging fruit first, which is what we're really talking about. The base of it's a sort of pyramid, I suppose, with layers of what you can do to get to what might be, for want of a better term, your optimal diet for you, this sort of where we're headed towards personalized nutrition and health. But the bottom layer is just make it whole foods. Cut out the ultra processed, and I'm very careful to use the term ultra processed, not processed, because canned tomatoes and canned legumes and cooking is processing at the end of the day. Some processing certainly makes food safer. We're the only species on earth that cooks our food and makes food so delicious. You know, that is part of what it means to be human. There's a lovely documentary, I think it was Michael Pollan that did it on called Cooked, that was literally around that. And I think he's got a book of that name. I hope I'm getting the right author. I hope it was Michael. Anyway, and it's about the fact that that's what makes us uniquely human. You know, we have cuisine, whereas other animals just eat what's available. So, you know, it's important that we have that whole food foundation. Then you layer over the top of that. Have you got any particular medical concerns? Have you got allergies and intolerance to certain foods? And well, some of, you know, what is your gut microbiome? Can you alter the gut microbiome? Is it causing some of those problems? We've got Denise's whole area of genetics, and where do genetics tie in? And that does influence. So, you know I'm a poor methylator, so I do take a methylated folate supplement because I know that that's a particular part that my body's not good at. I know that I'm not good at making long-chain omega-3 fats that are crucial for brain health. So because I've done my genes, I know that. And so therefore, I make sure that I'm always having oily fish, or that I do take a supplement that gives me those fats, because I'm not good at making them. Someone else might get away with a vegan diet a lot more and not have such a requirement for some of these things. And then right at the top of this then is looking at, you know, your availability of food, affordability of food, all this stuff comes into it, and supplements is at the top. So, okay, if I've got all this stuff right, but if your base diet is crap,
it's true.
If that's the worst word that you say, you're out of our league
It was
already.
our first podcast, and we were 1 minute in before, I think maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe 3 minutes in before some swear words came.
That was me. I was the host, and I came up with it. And Joe, you know what else? If you haven't changed your behaviours and your ways, if you're actually, you know, Denise gave us a great story, which we may not have shared yet on the pod, but about, you know, a client that wouldn't change the stressful ways and therefore couldn't cure the illness that they had. It's that, do we ever stop? You know, do we make time for ourselves? Are we in appreciation? Are we in gratitude? Are we meditating? Are we breathing? Are we sleeping properly? Is our water purified, or at least clean? You know, not laden with all sorts of other things. It's like these simple things that are really at the base level, that we don't get those things right. And we'll cover off on all those. We'll do an episode in each one of those, because they're all quite magical, really. But if you don't get that right, everything else is just falling on deaf ears, really. It's just being passed through the system and not really grabbing onto anything.
Just going also back to this idea of when supplements are necessary, would you add in that pyramid another layer that also takes account for sort of modern intensive agriculture, where we've got depleted soils, we spray our foods, there certainly isn't the nutrition that there was in the soil, the minerals. Are we just endemically deficient because our soils are deficient, because our food isn't giving us the nutrients that our grandparents or our ancestors once had available to them?
Well, do you know what? That's something I'm asked about a lot, and I hear people report that. But when you actually look for the evidence to back up that claim, it's just not there. So there are. I absolutely agree with you in that there are huge problems. It's why I get frustrated. A big area that I'm involved in right now is understanding sustainability, particularly around diets. And I keep hearing this in the media, this simple message of just eat more plants and eat less animal foods. that does not solve our problems with our farming systems. It doesn't solve the problem of soil erosion, of fertilizers, artificial fertilizers having to be used because of the nutrient depletion in our soils. It doesn't solve our issues around land use, around water use, around energy use, and so on. Monocrops, I could go on and on and on.
It's going to create new problems.
Well, we've got our CEO, Nathan, here, who is a big advocate of sustainable agricultural practices. Maybe we'll bring him in for a conversation around that as well.
What's interesting there is that, you might have heard the term regenerative agriculture.
Regenerative agriculture. That was the word I was looking for.
That's around bringing animals have to be
back. Yeah.
Yeah.
To the soil. And so look, back to your question, Danny, I think there's not strong evidence that suddenly we're all really deficient in lots of nutrients, because although we are deficient in some, and there's some, but let's come back also to the fact it's not just soils, it's the way that we're eating.
And you come back to you saying 7% of people meet the requirements for their vegetable intake. So they're just not even eating enough anyway. And if I just make a quick point, it's making me remember something that you said that I thought was really important, that I think needs to get out to everyone as well, because I do tend to say that our food may not have as much nutrition in it, and therefore people might be more at risk of nutrient deficiencies and things like that. But we have to be cautious with the language, because I'm sure it was you when we were at the conference in Brisbane at the end of last year. It was you. We got a question from a practitioner who put her hand up and said that she was working in the cancer space, I think, but was telling people not to eat plant foods if they couldn't afford organic because it was being sprayed. And that was a concern, because she was saying people couldn't afford the organic, so they're actually now avoiding plant foods because they're nutrient poor and they're sprayed with all these chemicals and toxins. And then the response from you, which I thought was very good, was all the studies we have when it has 5 serves of veggies, 2 serves of fruit, or all these things, all those studies that show that these plant foods are really healthy are actually not done in organic foods. So even though organic could be better and possibly, has maybe more nutrients, less chemicals, if people can afford that, amazing. If you can get something local and, growing it in your backyard, but if you can't afford it, don't then not go and get vegetables from the supermarket because you think they're sprayed or you think they're nutrient poor, because that was a practitioner. Do you remember that question? And I thought to myself, wow, is that what people are hearing? Yeah.
Cost of living rises right now. And so I've always been uncomfortable with telling people they've got to buy organic food, because there's not actually strong evidence there's more nutrients. The biggest difference is around there may be traces of some pests, and it's very different between different foods. And we get that dirty dozen always gets thrown up, but that's American data. It's not actually Australian data. So I don't follow that at all myself. I think it is, you're absolutely on the money there, Denise, that the key thing we have to get to people is eat more plant food. Farmers are not willy-nilly spraying chemicals are extremely expensive. I'm talking pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides and so on. They're extremely expensive. So they're not willy-nilly being thrown onto our food and produce. And in a country like Australia, we have very strict rules around when these chemicals are allowed to be used. Our food produce has to be tested in order to make sure that it's, the levels are under those known to be harmful. The people who are most at harm from pesticides are the farmers spraying it, because they are coming into much greater contact. So I think on the balance, I'm not saying that they're not a problem, and I'm not saying that some of these things might be carcinogenic. They're certainly shown to be carcinogenic in labs at certain quantities, but the strongest evidence we've got at the moment is that eating more of these plant foods, even if there are minute traces of some of these chemicals, that good is far outweighing any potential harm. And I think we've got to really make sure people get that message. Not eating these things is more harmful than eating a good whole plant-rich diet.
And if we're
that goes back to my complex to simple thing again.
Yeah.
Because people listening, there's so much stress. It's huge relief in just going, oh, right, I can't get to that unachievable height of organic food every week, or even access to it, let alone affordability sometimes. So just knowing, okay, if I get the basics right and work from there, then I'm off to a good start.
And on top of that, we do have livers and kidneys and guts and systems that can tolerate some chemicals and toxins. Every day we're exposed to things. So if someone is living a healthy life and going even beyond the food, they're exercising, so blood's pumping, they're pushing things through them, they're drinking plenty of water, they're using their bowels every day, good motility, they use that word
motility,
again.
yeah.
But you're getting rid of waste every day. If you are concerned with chemicals and toxins, another way we get rid of things is through sweating. If you're sleeping well, digestive system's good, we actually can, our systems can tolerate quite a bit. We have, I was going to say oxidative stress. I'm introducing a new word here, but just, we have these reactions in our body and, sunlight, UV, all these little things cause something called oxidative stress. We can tolerate a little bit. It's just as long as we've got enough antioxidants, which come from our food. Actually, the food can help compensate with some of those things. But yeah, if your system, your body, is running relatively well, we have the capacity to deal with these things. It's when we're not using our bowels, for example, someone is really constipated and you start, these wastes are building up, or you are eating these foods and perhaps you're actually missing out on lots of other nutrients. You're nutrient deficient, let's say, for example, zinc or minerals or, Bs. You're deficient in some of these things, you're going to be more susceptible to those chemicals and toxins because we use those minerals also to help eliminate chemicals and toxins. Exactly. So it's all of this coming together.
Yeah.
People go on these detox diets. I hate that term because I just go, what do you think you're doing? Yes, it's a good idea every now and again to, really pull the reins in and eat really well and, cut down at least on things like alcohol and whatever else you're exposing your body to. But your body is detoxing all of the time. Unless you've got a liver problem, that's your liver's job. What's going on in the gut, it brings us back to the gut microbiome. Our little friendly microbes in there are helping to break down and get rid of toxins. And going to the toilet every day is really important for that because that's our waste removal. That's you detoxing. So, that's the things to address, not going on some crazy expensive, detox diet that comes in a box and tells you that this is going to detox you. It's,
and striking a balance in there too. I know from my own personal experience, I work with a beautiful chiropractor, and whenever I get a bit like I'm sort of full of stuff, something's got to clear out of me and I'm a bit under that detox pump, my glands will come up a little bit or whatever it might be. And he'll go, just double the magnesium today. And I notice that if I take the right magnesium, for example, because it's apparently associated with detoxification pathways, it'll clear out of me so much quicker.
Magnesium does help move things through, yes.
And then the other thing is, recently I was feeling deficient and energy and it's like heart stuff and everything else. And I had the intuition that I'd many years ago taken CoQ10. So I found a quality CoQ10 and took the CoQ10, and the difference in my energy levels were amazing straight away. So there is a lot to be said for supplementation in exactly the right areas.
Yeah.
Well, at your age, you're probably producing half the CoQ10 you did when you were 18.
No, he's not that old. 65.
Well, okay.
I'm 55, so I'm 10 years short of that.
65,
10 years short of that.
65, you're producing half the amount as like a 20-year-old. But I was deficient. I measured my levels last year before I did my healthy aging study, which I'm sure we'll talk about on another podcast. Yeah. Just because I was adding, I wanted to put ubiquinol, CoQ10, a supplement in, but I thought, I'm trying to come up with a protocol. Do we need it? Do we not need it? I thought it's energy, mitochondria, which are like your little batteries. Anyway, to help me make the decision, I did my blood levels and I was shocked that I was low. And for me too, CoQ10, ubiquinol makes a big difference.
How accurate though are blood levels for CoQ10 when they're found inside the cells?
I can't answer that because it's not a common test. When I walked into the pathology lab, she just looked at me when I asked for it. She's like, oh my God, and she's ringing someone and didn't know what to do. It's rarely tested. They do it, obviously, and I did it through a standard path lab, but yeah.
So tell me, you put it in and you took it for how many weeks?
3 months.
3 months, and what happened?
Felt great, but it was part of a whole protocol with, food, 6 serves of veggies, I said, relatively high protein. It was a whole protocol, because if we're thinking about healthy aging, like I said before, it's really not one thing. There was a component of sleep, mindfulness, strength training, it was.
So I had all those pieces in place already, the healthy diet, the sleep, the meditation, everything else, and I was feeling this pinch, and then I put the CoQ10 in. It was the only thing I changed.
There you go.
And I spoke to you guys about it in that meeting we had, and I was like, I could feel the difference within a few days. So isn't that interesting as well?
Because you needed
the
it.
Deficiencies.
So that's because your body actually
so
needed
identifying deficiencies is another major thing that we need to do.
So, we can have a wider discussion around that and mitochondrial health, because when we want to talk about, mitochondrial health is
down. Mitochondrial health.
Well, it's the driver of so much disease, and CoQ10 is obviously an important element that drives normal mitochondrial function that gives you energy.
So it's a whole other podcast.
It's a whole. We can get a mitochondrial.
I can do some research in between now and then and find out if the blood test is actually reliable, because I don't know.
Yeah, and we'll start with what is mitochondria.
What is mitochondria? We'll start with
anyway.
that. Yeah. Look, Joe, I'd like to move on to. We've been speaking about, I suppose, changes in our diet over the last 100 or so years, particularly when we've sort of seen the introduction of processed foods, fast foods, junk foods, which has really taken over much of society and how they eat. But I do want to come to or talk about, I think it was a pivotal change in our history. It happened about 60 years ago when there was a request to investigate why there was a growing trend in heart disease in the United States. And the United States government commissioned a scientist called Ancel Keys, tasked him with the job, and he conducted what was called the 7 countries trial. And he came to the conclusion that those countries that ate the most saturated fat had the greater propensity for heart disease and incidence of heart attack. I understand that, in fact, it was a 22-country trial, and he cherry-picked those 7 countries that matched his hypothesis. And, in fact, there were countries
that would never happen.
Yeah, there's a...
To defend Ansel.
Okay. Yeah.
White paper that was led by David Katz, who's a doctor in the States. He was the president of the Lifestyle Medicine Society in America. So I know David relatively well. I've presented alongside him many times. And he actually has a white paper that you can go to and read online. I speak about this actually a lot in my Audible book, Heartful, What to Eat for a Healthier Heart. I talk about this because it's something that is brought up, and there's a lot of misinformation around the 7-country study. What we have to remember about nutrition research is that it's very, very complex. Diets are complex. It's not like a drug trial that we can go give a placebo to this group and give a drug to this group, and let's look at what happens and what the outcomes are. Diet is very complicated. One, measuring it, as we discussed before, is really, really difficult. Secondly, getting people to change diets and do interventions is really, really difficult. And then when we look at things that ail us today, they're largely what we call chronic diseases, and that means they develop over many years, and in lots of cases, several decades. So they don't appear overnight. So, measuring someone's diet for a short space of time is a very hard way to try to idea. So we have to look at a whole load of different data. We look at what's called epidemiological data. So we're looking at populations. We look at follow large numbers of people over time. We do intervention studies where you might put people, like the PREDIMED is the famous Mediterranean diet study, where you put groups on specific diets, adding in particular foods or whatever. Or you can do shorter term studies. There's a whole load of different ways of doing it. We can look at animals, we can look at cell studies and so on to start understanding mechanisms. And it's only when you collectively put all that information together that you start to get a bigger picture. So what I'll say about nutrition science is that it's a relatively young science. We only discovered things like vitamin C and other nutrients and so on last century. So it's a relatively young area of science. And I always question why it is that we look at medicine and we don't question that we do things differently, that we no longer standardly put leeches on people when they go into hospital to treat particular diseases, or, we no longer use a frontal lobotomy to treat mental health. We don't question. We might look back and go, God, that was crazy that was once thought was a good treatment. We accept that medical science moves on. Why don't we do the same for nutrition science? It's really important we don't judge past researchers like Ancel Keys with the lens of today. Mm-hmm. His research was valid, but it didn't give us the whole picture. He's been criticized for, well, why did he pick saturated fat and not sugar? He did look at sugar. It just wasn't as strong an association as the one that was for saturated fat. What he didn't pick up in his study, however, was that within saturated fats, it's not one type of fat. There's a family of different fats that fall into saturated fats. He didn't pick up that there's a difference between those saturated fats. He didn't pick up that it matters what else is in the diet, what other fats are in the diet. He didn't pick up the fact that it's not just about total cholesterol. It's actually about your cholesterol profile, about the functioning of that cholesterol. And there's some genetic differences and so on in there too. So I think that study we shouldn't be throwing it out. We should be building on the information of past studies and really trying to drill down. Okay, there might be some things we didn't know. There's certainly some things that we went wrong. I certainly agree that we've demonized fat overall and incorrectly. But when it comes to saturated fat, it's not completely. It may have been shown there's not a direct link between saturated fat and heart disease, but it's what replaces the saturated fat that's really key.
So can we talk about that? Yes, and that no, he didn't. But off the back of that study was really a worldwide policy to change our diets, to move away from saturated fat, to increase our carbohydrate consumption, and to consume vegetable fats. Omega-6s.
That's where the mistakes were made, not his original work. That Ansel Keys actually was he even wrote a Mediterranean diet cookbook or something. He lived in Italy for a long time. And I believe he died in Italy, but he was very promoting of using extra virgin olive oil and having plenty of plant foods. His intention from his research was to teach people to have a fiber, plant-rich diet with fish and lean meats and eggs and so on. That was his intention. He didn't realize the food industry would respond by saying, let's produce a whole load of ultra-processed foods, taking out saturated fat and sticking in refined carbohydrates instead, or vegetable oils, or, he didn't intend for that to happen.
So what's the problem with that? I mean, what happens when we eat those foods, the refined carbohydrates and the omega-6 rich vegetable fats? We ate them as a society. We were pulling blended vegetable oils in plastic bottles off the shelves by the droves. And we were consuming that. Certainly as I was growing up, that's all we ate as far as vegetable. We actually ate olive oil as well, but cooking was with that vegetable. What's the problem with that? We were told to eat more vegetables. What's wrong with eating more vegetable oil?
And look, my disclaimer, I am on the board of Cobram Estate Olive Oil, Olive. So, but I'm on the board because I've worked and researched in this area for many, many years. So I was their nutrition consultant for 15 years before I joined the board a couple of years ago. So I've always been a strong advocate for extra virgin olive oil. In my mind, is a totally different food. It's like the juice of a fresh olive. That's what it is. Refined seed oils are you just have to look at the processing involved to get an oil out the seed and make it fit for human consumption. So I am not a fan of these things. However, what I will say is that I do think some of the there's not really strong evidence to start supporting some of the toxic aspects of that. The biggest problem with them are that they're providing a whole lot of fat, they're providing calories, they don't contain things like the polyphenol profile that you'll find in extra virgin olive oil that has this enormous benefit. And by providing, you touched on it, Danny, by saying about the omega-6s, one of the biggest issues when we look back in the past, the ratio of, and these are all polyunsaturated fats, omega-6s to omega-3s, and the omega-3s concentrate in your brain. The ratio used to be closer to 1-to-1. Because these vegetable oils seed oils have been, it's actually a misnomer to call them vegetable oils because they're not from vegetables, but let's call them seed oils. What's happening is that's pushing up omega-6s, making it very hard for us to absorb and utilize omega-3s. So we've suddenly got this more or less 14-to-1 ratio that is massively problematic. And these have inflammatory pathways compared to the anti-inflammatory pathways or far less inflammatory pathways with the omega-3 fats. So it's throwing off our balance of fats. And to me, that's the biggest issue.
Yes, and those higher omega-6s, like you said, pro-inflammatory, sort of increasing inflammation. And it's not that all the omega-6s are bad, it's just that when you have that higher omega-6, like you said, ratio compared to omega-3, which is very anti-inflammatory, and most of the research has shown, I think with the strongest data we have, if you look at things like healthy aging, even cardiovascular disease, brain, even though, of course, we want to start with the foundations of all the food, the exercise, but the stronger evidence we have is for omega-3s. For being anti-inflammatory, but also with chronic conditions like cardiovascular health, Alzheimer's, depression. Like we have a lot of evidence to show that omega-3s are really beneficial and potentially can even reduce risk of certain things. And people just are not getting enough of them in their diet.
So that's my question now. What does this mean? What does this mean for the average person? What do they need to get in and what do they need to get out?
Seafood.
They need to eat more seafood. And some things like, if you are vegan or vegetarian, you can get an algal supplement or you can eat sort of algal products in your drinks, or there's different ways, but recognize that the long chain omega-3s don't occur in plant foods. They're in animal foods, and our best sources come from the sea. So especially oily fish, not just salmon. Everyone always thinks about salmon, but it's good salmon's hard to get in Australia. But so trout and sardines, and we had an event I was at the other night. We had these beautiful herring that were done in a very sort of Scandinavian kind of way. We eat a lot of herring in Scotland. So herring and kippers and anchovies, and so all of those fish, but you'll even get some long chain omega-3s in your crustaceans. So mussels and oysters, and even a little bit in prawns. That kind of food from the sea is really, really good. And you'll get amounts as well from our beef. Most cattle and sheep in Australia are on grass, and they're producing relatively good level amounts of long chain omega-3s.
That's what I was just about to say to you. The grass-fed meats, and even for, I believe it's kangaroo. I mean, I know different states in Australia. I mean, I moved to Adelaide. I lived in Adelaide for a while, where kangaroo is everywhere. I grew up in Melbourne, where it is not normal to eat kangaroo, but certain places in Australia they do. But it's actually a really lean meat that's got lots of iron and really high in omega-3. So these grass-fed, as you said, animals. But obviously, if you're getting beef that's fed on grains, then it's a different profile. So more the grass-fed.
And also eggs as well. So pasture-fed chickens as well that eat green leafy vegetables and grasses.
Eggs are great.
Yeah.
Denise is absolutely right. But a lot of that data is coming out of the States. Here in Australia, even our cattle that are fed on grain, it's for a relatively short period of the ends of their life. Yeah. So we have a very different production system here in Australia. And so, the levels are not as starkly different as we see that may come out of other countries. So rest assured that if you're eating lean red meat that's Australian or New Zealand, they've spent most of their life on grass. So
yeah, I don't know any farms in Australia. Actually, my family were on my father's side. Had dairy cattle in sort of Gippsland, Leongatha, and believe me, there was just rolling green hills for as far as you could see, and you just when you think about Australia and New Zealand, I don't think I've ever seen cattle not being out in grass, So,
Joe, I've got a question for you because what I love sitting with you is that you're very balanced. You're very common sense. You're just dispelling a lot of stuff, which is really, really cool. If I asked you the question, it's almost like a cutting edge question. So where are you most excited or most intrigued or almost most challenged in your own research and study? Where do you think the next things, because obviously we make evolution through sometimes little quantum shifts and quantum jumps. What are you thinking is the thing that's on the edge next for us? What are you seeing and getting passionate, excited, and potentially challenged about?
Well, aging, I think, without a doubt. Oh, that may be because I'm now 51.
It's just coming into focus.
Yeah. It's like, do you want to come and do a podcast on health span? She's like, okay.
Okay, what can I do to make sure that I've got another 50 years in me? That's what I want. Yeah. I think it's hugely interesting. The scientist in me is just hugely interested in that science of aging and the idea that, hang on, there's so many aspects. I don't believe in, I'm not sure I'm quite buying into the whole aging as a disease that some longevity researchers are talking about. But I think it's hugely intriguing to start looking at, and it's an area that I am researching and looking into right now. There's particular things I take and do that are based, that are really cutting edge, that we don't have solid evidence and proof for.
Do you want to share your secrets?
They're telling you everything that I do, but
we might be on the same things. We're probably taking the same things.
I'd be very interested to know what it is that you are taking. So
are you willing to disclose? Are you willing to disclose your current regime?
Can I tell you something that's very frustrating about being a health professional is that, you're very tied with what you're allowed to say and recommend and do, because I don't want to heavily influence people into thinking they have to buy certain things. But look, I'm intrigued with the idea of raising NMN levels because that's another thing that falls as we get and may impact energy. So I'm looking at that research, some particular molecules that are present in foods, but that may not be there in the quantities that we need and might be beneficial to take as supplements to help push us more. I've been communicating lately with a New Zealand pharmacist who's got a line of different sort of compounds, and he's got a very interesting company trying to put, but at the moment, a lot of these supplements are very, very expensive. And that's part of my hesitancy in saying to people, I think they work, because I don't know. I'm intrigued to see the results. He's got his first clinical trials coming out, and he's looking at health span. And so I'm intrigued to see what some of those measures of biological versus, your metabolic age and so on. So let's wait and see what those studies say. I think that's all a hugely interesting area, but it doesn't take away from my original point about doing some of those really key foundational things first. I describe to people, and I've used this analogy for a very long time, but I think it still stands, is I think of it as a kind of like a graphic equalizer, and I'm probably being very old-fashioned and showing my age here. You probably don't live like this anymore at all. I picture it as, those little dials where I think of sleep, stress, activity, exercise, social connections and social life, and diet, of course, and drinks I include separately, which I don't just mean I like my glass of wine, but I also mean hydration and coffee and tea and so on. And I think of all of those things. And sometimes if you're not feeling the best, as you were saying, Trevor, you had that feeling lately, I feel a bit out of kilter. It's about stopping and going, okay, where am I? Which one of is everything out of whack? Or is it exercise that's really out of whack? I've been sitting at my desk too much, not moving enough. Is my sleep really out of whack? Which for me, undoubtedly, probably, that's very menopausal. That'll be my foggy brain coming in. So I think my sleep can be pretty appalling. What can I do to improve my sleep? Oh, my diet's a bit out of whack because I've been traveling a lot and it gets harder to do. So you think of this graphic equalizer, and sometimes everything needs tweaking. Sometimes there's something that's blindingly obvious that needs to be tweaked. And so it comes back to that, getting all of that. And that's just always a work in progress throughout your life. And it's never, to me, lifestyle medicine is not something that, well, this is done. I'm a professional in this area. I know what I'm doing. I'm always perfect. No,
it's up and down. It's always up and down.
Evaluate and you tweak. And then this longevity piece is the exciting part of how can science help me to make sure that I, can keep doing this for as long as possible.
I think Trevor wants to ask you something, but I don't know if I've told you at the study that I did I think you kind of do know, maybe the healthy aging study where we were looking at biological age and everything. So we will share that with you off air later, and maybe we're going to do some podcasts about all of that and definitely delving into that. So yeah, you can do some biological age testing with me if you want. I would love to do that with you.
And we did skip past M&M earlier, but we'll do a whole podcast on that as well, because people need to understand what it is. M&M.
Not the rapper.
Not M&M. Lose yourself in the music. No, Joe, you've led yourself to my favourite question, and it is around health span, and it's basically the deeper why question. So if we were able to unlock the potential of all these things that we're all working on together, and you're able to get an extra 10 years of health span, 10 years of really active, healthy life, right into 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever it is, where you could be your full faculty self. Why would you want it? What do you want to do with that 10 years? And what impact do you think that would have on your family, the world around you, if you could get that 10 years?
Because I love so many aspects of my life. I love not just my work. I'm fortunate that I've found a career that I really love. Don't get me wrong, there's aspects of my work that are a pain in the neck like everyone else, but I'm passionate about my area of interest. So I want to keep doing what I'm doing. I don't have any aspirations to retire, but I also have lots of things I do in my social life. I love travel. I love hiking. I love skiing. I want to be able to ski. Well, my uncle was skiing with me 3 months before he died, and he was in his 80s. I want to be that person that I'm skiing right until, death's knocking at my door. So I love the outdoors. I love dogs. I love my family. My family live on the other side of the world. I've got my sons here in Australia, obviously, but my parents and siblings and nieces, nephews, and so on. So I want to be able to travel. I want to be able to see the world. I want to be able to continue being productive in my professional life. I have a reasonably new partner. I want my time with him, that will be nice. And so I want to keep living. And I think that's a really key point that people like, David Sinclair talk about the potential to live to 124. Well, maybe. But is that fabulous? I don't know. I'm a bit worried my money will run out if I live till I'm 100. Health span's more important because at the moment we've done an extraordinary job. I think sometimes we're a bit harsh on ourselves as the human race. Let's not forget we've increased lifespan incredibly. Lifespan over the last century or two has exponentially increased, but we've kind of hit this ceiling. And what's happening at the moment is that unfortunately for most people, at least the last decade, if not longer, is spent in ill health. And so health span to me is more interesting really than life, because there's a whole load of problems with if everybody lives till they're 120 with population growth, and that's a whole other conversation. But if we can just help people to have better health spans so that that period of the end of your life where you're not well is much, much shorter, then how amazing would that be? We also lift the load on medical practice, on the cost of medical care at the end of life.
The people that have to care for us, taking the pressure off our children, said I've cared for both of my parents. We had that chat at the end of mine, and of course things will happen. I mean, you mentioned about, aging as a disease, and I know what you're talking about. And I also don't think we should say aging is a disease either. Aging actually can be a blessing. We can, grow into new things.
Wisdom.
We become wiser and all sorts of things. But I think not having to have your children look after you for so long. It might happen, but that's a burden itself. Yeah.
You did mention that for the last 10 years of people's lives, unfortunately for many, it's the last 30 or 40 years where they sort of put up with chronic disease, and usually multiple chronic diseases.
Yeah, and then the last 10,
for the
really
reasons that we just went through, at least some of those. But look, I think that's a great wrap-up question. I've actually got one more question I would like to ask, because you also in your profile call yourself a food futurist. And I'm interested to know what that is. And I'm also interested to know, does that also incorporate personalized nutrition? What does that mean, and how is that going to play a role?
Is that the next podcast?
That'll be the next podcast.
Because that's a lot.
In person. We'll make sure to have you in person for that one.
I coined the name food futurist because I was trying to bring into, I'm sort of dropping the dietitian part of it, not because, hats off to all the dietitians out there, only because I don't really work as a dietitian. So food futurist came into play because I'm essentially a nutrition scientist who's interested in science communication is what I do. And the food futurist part comes in because I'd done all these future of food events last year. So I was researching a lot of how can we solve some of the problems that we have in feeding a growing population. We're going to be 10 billion by 2050. And how can we feed us well while still looking after our planet? That's really what food futurist means. So the work I'm doing in sustainable diets, I'm involved with one of my other colleagues in a Plants for Space project. And that's really, and why I'm interested, you won't find me heading off into space anytime soon, but I am interested in the lessons that we can learn from that might solve some of the issues we have in our food systems here on Earth. And it brings in a lot of what we've talked about today, is that bringing in, how do we change food systems? How do we change everything from agriculture to the way that foods are made and produced, to me helping. I've always had a mission to how can I make healthy eating easier for people? My big brother used to always say to me, Joe, but you do it so effortlessly. Healthy eating's easy for you. And so I've always had, how can you make it easy for me? So I've always had that in my mind. How can I help make healthy eating easier for people? And that's what Food Futurist is about. Answering helping solve the problems that we've got in the future while making it easier for people to eat well.
Do you see a place for personalization? Because you touched on that a couple of times. So what is your vision of how we're going to personalize nutrition?
I see personalized nutrition. You know what? If I'm being truthful, I have a little bit of a battle with it, because I have a battle with this idea that we're also elite and individual.
Yeah.
I need something totally different to you. I don't look at a dog and say you need something very different to the other dog. We are human species. Yes, we have unique DNA. So do you know what I see personal nutrition as? And Denise does a lot more of this, so forgive me, Denise. But what I see it as is being the tweaking, right? The foundations are the same for all of us. But what personalization is about tweaking it to suit me better, right? So some people are allergic to strawberries, for goodness sake. They can't have strawberries. Strawberries are great for me, but they could kill someone else. That's where the personalization comes in. But I think just don't forget what the key foundations are that are similar to all of us. We all need to be well nourished. We need to get our nutrients. We need to feed our gut microbiomes. We need to be well hydrated. We need social connections and sleep and exercise and so on. But just in the same way that we might personalize exercise, and at this stage of my life, my exercise is different to what I was doing in my 20s. Despite my attempt to slow down aging, there are some aches and pains and, wrinkles and whatever else happens. So I'm not managing to halt it completely. But that's where the personalization comes in. It's tweaking it to make it better and work better for me and for you.
Well, we could keep on going.
Amazing.
And we will. We are going to catch up again. And as I mentioned, hopefully in person next time. It was great to seeing you in person. Look, before we wind up, where can people find you if they're actually looking for more information or want to get in contact with you?
Well, I'd love you to
Fantastic.
follow me online.
Well,
and
Dr. Joanna
on
McMillan,
Instagram.
thank you
I'm
so
not
much.
on TikTok.
Really interesting.
So don't go there looking
Very
for
much
me, but I am
food
on
for
Instagram,
thought
and I have
and
a professional
continued
Facebook
discussion.
page, so that's just at
Thank you,
Dr.
Jo.
Joanna McMillan.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank
on
you
LinkedIn,
so
of course,
much.
as well.
Awesome.
And then my website
We
is
look
just
forward to speaking to you again.
drjoanna.com. Very
God, that could have gone on. You talk about exercise. I was about to say, Joe and I used to work in the fitness industry. We used to teach you. And I was like, oh, no, stop, Denise, stop.
Well, are we still rolling? Okay.
Yeah, but that would be, edit that out.
That's all right. The
That could be a little blooper
The
thing.
amateurish way we're doing this is fine. I just thought,
No.
no.
It was great. I
The-
loved all the talking about the 7 studies and stuff, like just building on things, and yeah, really, really good.
Fantastic. I just wanted to say to thank the viewer and the listener, and if they want to contact us with any questions, or if they've got any discussion points they'd like to hear us have on any episode, they can contact us on info@futurelabpodcast.com.au. So thank you for listening. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
We'll see you again
Thank
soon.
you.